My name is Michael Holtmann. I'm the director of the Center for the Art of Translation and Two Lines Press, based here in San Francisco. You may have heard me at some point say, we champion translation, literary translation in particular, and I'm committed to bringing you and other readers original voices. So part of our conversation today is going to be with these terrific writers on stage with me. I'm going to give them each a short introduction. We'll talk a little bit about their work and how it relates to translation, and then, of course, we'll make sure you have some time to ask questions. So, to my left, Katrina Dodson is the recipient of the 2016 PEN Translation Prize for her translation of this marvelous tome, Clarice Lispector's Complete Stories. If you don't own it, you should. She is also a recent PhD recipient in comparative literature at UC Berkeley. Her dissertation was Traveling Properties, the Disorienting Language and Landscapes of Elizabeth Bishop in Brazil. She has spent time in Brazil several times, most recently as a Fulbright Hays Fellow. Amara Lakhous, to my right, is the author of this incredible book, The Prank of the Good Little Virgin of Villa Ormea. He was born in Algiers in 1970. He has a book called The Clash of Civilizations over an Elevator in Piazza Vittorio, which won Italy's prestigious Flaiano Prize. His latest book has been described as a fun and farcical whodunit about life in multicultural Italy. It also deals with some really serious issues that I think everyone in this room can relate to, so we'll touch on that in a little bit. Lakhous has a degree in philosophy from the University of Algiers and another in cultural anthropology from the University at La Sapienza, Rome. Jung Young-Moon, on my right, was born in Hamgyong, South Gyeongsang province in South Korea in 1965. He made his literary debut in 1996 with the novel A Man Who Barely Exists. His most recent book in English is the collection A Most Ambiguous Sunday and Other Stories. But he has two books forthcoming.
I found this book on the
really?
streets.
Really?
Bus.
Fantastic.
Yesterday.
Oh, great. So he has two books forthcoming this summer, one of which is already available here at the Bay Area Book Festival. It's called A Contrived World, and it takes as its inspiration the city of San Francisco, so I'm very excited to touch on that today. And he also has another book called Vaseline Buddha, which will be published in July, again in English. He's an accomplished translator himself. He's translated more than 40 books from English into Korean, including works by John Fowles, Raymond Carver, and Germaine Greer, some really interesting writers. I'm very curious to hear about what they must be like in Korean. His work has won numerous awards, including the 12th Dongseo Literary Award, the Han Mu-suk Literary Award, and the Daesan Literary Award, among others. Idra Novey, here on my left, is the author you may be familiar with from her book Ways to Disappear, which the Wall Street Journal described as a spare, witty riddle of a novel. She's translated several books from Portuguese and Spanish, including Clarice Lispector's The Passion According to G.H. So you have two Lispector translators joining us today. Novey's work has been featured on NPR's All Things Considered and in Slate, the Paris Review, and Guernica, among others. She was born in Western Pennsylvania and has lived in Chile and Brazil. Now, do you still reside in New York?
I do.
You reside in Brooklyn, New York, and teaches at the Creative Writing Program at Princeton University. So, without further ado, I think we should leap into the work of Clarice Lispector with Katrina Dodson. For those of you who may not be familiar with this book or Clarice Lispector, this is kind of an incredible time for her work. I think that it's really come to the attention that it has rightfully deserved for many years. But she's very much kind of a modern writer from the 20th century. This collection of 85 stories was written over the course of her life and represents an incredible range of literary undertaking. I think that reading this book, you see what a masterful writer can do with the short story over time. Katrina, I'm curious to hear from you. Again, for maybe someone who hasn't yet had a chance to read much from this book, how would you capture what is unique and striking about this singular writer?
Okay, where do I begin?
Exactly.
I think anybody who just dips into even a page of Clarice Lispector's writing just feels the intensity and the power of it, and it's so. She writes like no one else, and I think both of us can speak to this. She's very difficult to translate because she's not openly avant-garde, but she'll just kind of be going along in a normal sentence, and then just one word will be off, or you'll think that that's not quite the description the word you're supposed to use there, and it's just, it's a disorienting experience. And so this collection, it's, as you said, every story she published from the age of 19 in 1940 to her death on the eve of her 57th birthday in 1977. So the last two stories are the two stories that were manuscripts left on her desk when she passed away. And it's I really love the stories. I think they're a mix of this kind of dark humor. They dip in and out of the everyday lives of a lot of women. So really just going through this collection of one woman's life's work. She also has a lot of stories about young girls, on the verge of womanhood, housewives, elderly women. Just a lot. Just the range of voices that she conjures is incredible. And so I think, do you get these amazing kind of glimpses of people's lives, but you also can just feel like the kind of electricity of her language. And it's hard to... I'm trying to think of a good example.
Well, it's a collection of 85 stories.
Yeah.
And if I'm right, you spent 3 years?
2 years.
2 years? 2 years.
Very intense years.
And, this incredible project. This is also, it's worth noting, this is the first time these stories have been collected in one volume. Even in Portuguese, they haven't been published as a collected
It
stories.
just came out in Brazil.
Okay.
Yep. Same cover.
But knowing there's this, incredible range of stories and that you have spent an intimate time with them, are there a couple that, you feel you carry with you that come back to you on a regular basis?
I'd say the story Love, Amor, which takes place in the Rio de Janeiro Botanical Garden, is the one that's closest to my heart. I've read it many times. I've taught it as a reading and composition instructor at Berkeley. In another, in Giovanni Pontiero, there was a previous version of it. And I definitely did more drafts of that story than any other. The Smallest Woman in the World is another one that's one of my favorites. But I think I love the story because it is this mix of being incredibly poetic. So it's this housewife who's coming home from grocery shopping on the tram in Rio de Janeiro, and she's kind of feeling a little bit smug about her perfect life. She's got this husband and 2 children. Like, she's planted these seeds and they're growing up perfectly. But she's in this, what she calls the dangerous hour of the day. So it's the late afternoon and nobody needs her anymore. And she kind of starts to drift and just remembers this kind of younger, wilder self that she had. And, starts to feel a little bit restless about this life that seems so perfect from the outside. And suddenly she sees this blind man standing at the tram stop chewing gum, and his mouth is opening and closing. And he's chewing whatever it is. She thinks that he's mocking her, that he's laughing at her, even though he can't see her. And it's this moment that just casts her into this abyss, and she drops her groceries and the eggs break, and she rushes off the tram in this kind of daze. And suddenly she doesn't know where she is, and she wanders into the botanical garden. And it's just this beautiful moment where she thinks she's found this refuge. It's just, she's in there, the trees and, the wind, and you might hear some birds. But all of a sudden, it just, everything kind of switches, and she sees like dark fruit stains on the bench that look like blood, and the pits look like little rotting brains, and there are parasites on the tree. So it's all of a sudden like death was all around, murders in the garden. So it's just, it's this amazing story because it seems like it's just a kind of mundane story about a life, a day in the life of a housewife, but then you've got this, crazy moment of kind of perverse, like, death and nature in the garden. And it's all very beautiful, so I recommend that story.
Many of them are very memorable and striking for their images and turns and the language. So clearly our panel is about translation, and language is going to be a major part of this talk. Clarice Lispector's Portuguese is strange. Can you tell us a little bit about managing that strangeness of her work?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I'm sure Idra can speak to this too. Right. I think absolutely. That was my most common question for all of. I had a kind of team of Brazilian friends and colleagues, and I would ask them questions whenever I kind of hit a snag. And that was my most common question was, does this sound strange to you in Portuguese? And oftentimes they'd say, yeah, this is strange, but it's just like one preposition is off, or it's like a word that doesn't exist but sounds as though it might exist. Like there's a story in which a woman is she's drifting off to sleep, and it says ela fantasiava, okay, it should be fantasiava. It's like she's kind of like daydreaming, dreaming, fantasizing, but it's fantasticava, and it's not a word, but it sounds like a word. So things like that, and there's one moment. So I would say, fantasticized in English, and it's just one word that's off on a whole page where everything else seems not so invented. And there's another moment later in the collections where the narrator says, "I never thought that the world and I would reach this point of wheat." Ponto de trigo, so like a point in time, and I just thought, well, what does this mean? Like point of maturity, like we've like reached this harvest or something. And I was googling everything and on forums and talking to people, and I talked to my editor and I, between us, I think must have talked to 10 or 15 Brazilians, and they all said, no, I don't know what it means. So I just had to leave it. So sometimes when you don't know, actually the best way is not to try to interpret it and say like, this point of harvest or maturity, but just say this point of wheat and let the reader just do what they will.
Katrina recently, well, it was in the fall, had a conversation with one of my colleagues, Scott Esposito, and that recording is available online, should any of you be curious to hear more about the specific book. But in that conversation, Katrina, you mentioned how by translating this particular book, you said that your Portuguese is better and your English is better.
Yes.
Can you talk a little bit about what that experience is like as a writer, kind of making new discoveries in English?
Yeah, I feel like I did this like independent study MFA in fiction and translation, just by training with her, going through this writer's life's work. It's amazing. And I could see, I write about her. I was writing about her in my dissertation, and then I ran out of time and just finished my dissertation without her. But I think, you see the variations in language. So in the beginning stories, beginning collections, her language is much more literary, and you feel this energy. She's really excited about writing stories, and they're much more kind of conventionally literary stories. I think like the language is much more poetic, and they have these kind of they have an arc where they end oftentimes with the kind of epiphany, or kind of. To the end they at the end they also do the end of her life, but I think just tracking her language. So in the beginning, the language I used was much more flowery, more adjectives and kind of more kind of romantic feel. And then toward the end of her life in the 70s, she just got really tired. I think she just felt like she'd done what she could in a more literary vein. She'd kind of mastered that. And then at the end, she says, I want the anti-literature. She just gets kind of like crazy, or so in the hour. it's almost at the hour of the start. In
Which is a great book.
Via Crucis of the Body and Where Were You at Night, she just starts writing kind of more like campier, pulpier fiction, and I started using words kind of like more kind of slang words or kind of looser. There was like a kind of looser feel to it toward the end. And at one point, when like her stories in Via Crucis of the Body get really sexy. They're like threesomes and murder and like a drag queen and his best friend who's a housewife by day and a stripper by night. They go after the same man. And at the end of the story, he's like, she gets the man and the drag queen, she says, like, you're not even a real woman. You don't even know how to fry an egg. And she's like, it's true. I'm not a real woman. So there's just like this like funnier moments. And so I think tracking that language, having to understand what that felt like in Portuguese and then trying to reproduce it in English, I definitely thought so much about the registers of language in English. And a lot of times I think you start going crazy because I'd say, is this a normal way to say things in Portuguese? But then I'd also say, is this a normal way to say things in English? Right. And so I think the internet is a fabulous tool. I can't imagine what it was like to translate before the internet because so much of language is embedded in the way it's used on a daily basis, or in a living situation and not just in the dictionary. And so I think so many of the ways you can kind of get a sense for how a word will fall on someone's ears is when you just hear it in usage. So when you just Google phrases, you can see you have all kinds of examples of how people are actually using the phrases in the news, on forums, some kid's blog, whatever. Yeah.
Well, kind of building on that idea, I think we should move on to this book, Ways to Disappear, Idra Novey's novel, which takes as its conceit the fact that a translator may know a writer extremely well. In the case of this book, the story opens up with with this great writer in Brazil who is missing. And the translator hears this news and feels compelled immediately to go to Brazil to help find her. And what's interesting, knowing that Idra Novey is herself a translator, has spent time in Brazil, has worked on Clarice Lispector as well. I'm curious to know how, this book erupted in you. You felt I have to capture and represent a translator in fiction. Oh.
So I, had translated a number of writers, both who are living and who are dead. And so if you're translating someone who's alive, you can email them and ask questions. And if they're not, you kind of have to create a character in your mind, sort of the way a fiction writer would, so that you're having this kind of concocted conversation with somebody and be like, I would sort of say to Clarice, I found a book of her letters and was reading them while I was translating her as a way to get to know her and create this false conversation in my head. And she became very much a character. And during that same process, I was kind of curious about the lives of translators and kept coming across novels that had translators in them. And none of the translators that I found resonated with my own experience of translators or the fascinating, adventurous, wild people that I knew who went into translation, who were just international and adventurous and just very generous spirited. And the translators I kept coming across, representations of them in fiction, were often inhibited people, or they would be, that they would sort of glom on to writers because the writers had really wild lives and they were too inhibited to go and be interesting people in their own right, or they resented. All the representations I found didn't quite jive with my experience of many of my friends who are translators. And so I think, as many writers find, you end up writing the book that you need and the book that you can't find. So I set out to write the book I wanted to read about the translator that I thought had been misrepresented, and to sort of find my way to convey what I think is the secret sort of superheroes of literature that hadn't been represented that way.
The main character, Emma, is driven and
That's a good one.
and very focused on trying to help be a part of this kind of mystery. Like, where did this writer go and why? And she turns to her books as clues to kind of lead her to where she might be or what she might have done. while you're constructing this story, were there incidents in your, in your reading, in your translations that kind of made you imagine, like a writer leaving you clues?
I think that translation is in some way kind of a mystery work. As Katrina was saying, you do have to search online. You have to search your mind. You have to search your past. You have to ask questions almost like an investigative reporter. You've got to figure things out. There's a missing person, and you need to figure out these answers. So, I think it is in some ways sort of a literary thriller. There's a loan shark and some significant poker debt. And I think that... in some ways, I did feel like I was like putting on some sort of, Sherlock Holmes hat and investigating in musty phone booths and things like that. So, and it's also just a great adventure to be a translator. And I think that it's a really joyful thing to do. And I felt like the depictions I'd found of translators didn't convey the joy of it and the pleasure of it. And, and people kept saying to me after I published the novel and, it was coming out in other languages, and especially after they heard about the film agent, and everyone's like, oh, I guess you're never going to translate it again. And I said, I'll translate my whole life because I love it, and I think I'm as addicted to it as some people may be to poker. So
This book also has some wonderful insights about translation and about language and about the way in which language can fail us sometimes. But I kind of wanted to single out a few moments. This happens kind of in the middle of the book, where Emma is thinking about translation as she has done throughout the book, as you can imagine. And wasn't the splendor of translation this very thing, to discover sentences this beautiful and then have the chance to make someone else hear their beauty who had yet to hear it, to arrive at least once at a moment this intimate and singular, which would not be possible without these words arranged in this order on this page. One of the other things that I like about the narrative in this book that I think is, kind of fun and unexpected is the way in which Emma is also chronicling her experience while she's in Brazil, and she's kind of keeping a notebook that perhaps she might use to write her own novel. But she has these moments where she singles out terms and then kind of weaves them into the story in a way. I'll give an example. This one is from a little later in the book. She writes the word chance. She's thinking about the idea of chance. And she writes, chance, from the Latin cadentia, that which falls out. 1, a force assumed to cause events that can neither be foreseen nor controlled, as in, she could find her mother only by chance and a yellow umbrella. In this case, there's this hotel that has yellow umbrellas. 2, a fleeting, favorable set of circumstances. See also, gamble, hazard. Can you just touch on a little bit about how, as you're writing this book, you made these kind of discoveries to add in, some of your maybe ideas about language or surprises that you've discovered perhaps on your travels or in your reading?
Well, I think as Katrina brought up, a lot of a translator's work is finding definitions. And I remember when I first started translating, I had a dictionary and would be traveling places that didn't have internet. But I do think, when you have it, it's fastest just kind of type it in and look it up that way. And the definitions would always seem inadequate, or the range of definitions would kind of be an art in itself, where you would look up a word in Portuguese and find things that seemed just absurdly, like different from each other. And so I just started to play with this, with definitions as a kind of prose poem, and how the definition was kind of up for grabs, and almost like the art of the definition. So I also think that I'm sort of a restless spirit. So when I was writing the book, I kind of said to myself, women writers have sort of disappeared from the record, and translators tend to disappear from the public record, unless either as a woman writer or as a translator, you sort of die in sort of a tragic way. You're like, die, because you translated the Bible and were burned as a heretic, or you stuck your head in your oven, in the oven, or something. I mean, like whatever is a Sylvia Plath sort of thing. So I do think that tragic deaths may give women writers or translators more visibility than they tend to have had historically. So I was thinking about all of those things. I was like, the chance of anyone paying attention to this book is probably pretty low, because how many women and translators and mothers are writing books that get a lot of visibility? So I was like, I might as well have as much fun as I can, because I didn't know what would happen with it. And I actually didn't tell anyone for about 4 years, even my own sister, that I was working on it. And so anytime I felt like I needed to do something new, I would actually just invent something else. I was like, well, I'm sort of tired of these characters. I wonder what's happening on the radio. And so I would just write radio reports. And then whenever I got to a place where I just wanted to break it up, I would start playing with the definitions. And so I kind of made up my own form in part, because translation, you're always waking up your own form. And writing and translation, I do think translation is a form of writing. And so I think I approached the novel as I would a translation, where you're creating a voice, but you're creating a voice which is in some ways an impossible voice, because you can't recreate something in Portuguese exactly. You have to create a version of it. So I think the creative act of translation was how I approached fiction, which might be why in some ways it kind of pushes against, I guess, conventional notions of fiction, and that the definitions really are absurd and the radio reports are over the top. Because I did came from this place of thinking about all the ways it would probably be destined for obscurity before it even was printed out. So I know.
Yeah. It's a terrific book, Ways to Disappear.
Thank you.
Yeah. I really enjoyed it. I want to see a film version of it. Kind of building on that idea, I think that Idra was saying a little bit, one of the ways that I think about translation is that translation is the closest form of reading. And I think that translators think about language in many different, sometimes conflicting ways. And kind of building on these ideas about language and kind of the power of language, or what languages may represent or mean, I want to move on to Amara Lakhous' work. This is his most recent book in English, The Prank of the Good Little Virgin of Via Ormea. Amara is, in addition to an Italian writer, he's written 2 of his books in Arabic, so both Arabic and Italian. His books, as I may have alluded to a little earlier, they have these, they're kind of light, or seemingly light, that deal with issues that I think are pretty profound and certainly very contemporary. Reading this book in particular, I can't help but think about the rhetoric in our country about immigration and the way we classify different groups of people, but he kind of sets it up almost like this small event that takes place that has these unexpected consequences. So that's my long-winded preamble. There's the main character of this book is he's a reporter. He's on a crime beat, and he's he seems like a little bit of a character himself, but he's also got a sense of kind of the ethical obligation in his work. And he goes to a crime scene where he hears that 2 boys have raped a girl. And he, is conducting his, he's professional, he's asking questions, but he really hasn't, written this story with a lot of, he doesn't have all the facts. So he writes the story in the conditional. And his editors change that. And that little turn sets this kind of eruption of anger and really, this really clear discrimination. I'd love to hear from you about, how this story came to be.
Thank you. Thank you. So this novel is just an example about living between many languages, and there are a lot of misunderstandings, because the same words very often have different meanings. I wrote my first novel in Arabic when I was in Algeria, and then in 1995 I moved to Italy and I started learning Italian, and after 8 years I wrote my first novel in Italian. But I'm still a bilingual writer because each novel has two versions, one in Italian, one in Arabic. So I can say that my works actually are self-translation. But the best definition of translation is Italian. Traduttore, traditore. Translator is traitor.
Right.
It's traitor in terms that the good translator is a creative. It's creative work translation. Listening about Portuguese, I have a very nice story about Portuguese. So when I moved to Italy, I lived in Rome for 16 years. One day, my friend said to me, "You know, Mario, our friend, is Portuguese." I said, "What's Portuguese? He's Italian. What's Portuguese?" He said, No, I know he's an Italian citizen, but he's Portuguese because he travels, he uses buses and subway without tickets. So in Rome, especially in Rome, fare il portoghese, that means you can travel without using tickets. So how can we translate this sentence? Is Portuguese. So you have to, of course it's more easy to put a note, but I think, this is my personal opinion, writers or translators, when they use notes, that means this is a sign of failure for me, because you have to be very creative. You have to find something, not just note. Note is to say that the readers, this is your job, this is your business. Go and, but you have to find a good solutions. And writing, especially in two languages, in Arabic and Italian, I have to be very creative, very original. And maybe the best example is translation of jokes and proverbs. Right. By the way, my wife hates my Algerian jokes, so I'm sorry, I can't tell you wonderful jokes. She always said against women. This is true, against women, but they are very funny. But I can't. Probably women. I mean, in Algeria, world have jokes against men. This is another story. So we can't. We can't translate jokes and proverbs because what is the reason? The reason that translation doesn't deal just with language. Because we can do this with Google. So Google is an expert in language. Translation deals with the context of language. The context of language is culture. So if you don't have access to culture, you can't translate. Absolutely, you can't translate. And I think the good translator is humble person. Because you have to ask questions. If you are arrogant, you can't do this job.
Yeah. Thank you for speaking so eloquently about those challenges. One of the things that Amara does particularly in this book, is he kind of, some of that is evident in the characters. I mentioned there's Enzo, who's this reporter for the newspaper. There's another character who has this, whose narrative kind of runs in parallel, and she's a woman. Her name's Patrizia, but she has another name that is Drabarimos. Mm-hmm. And we learned that name is a Roma name. And for those of you in the audience, in the United States, we don't think about Roma perhaps as often as you would in Europe. But the Roma, many of you may know, they're people who are often referred to as gypsies who travel beyond borders, who, some of them don't use money in the same way. They are often poor. They come from this tradition that's actually from the Middle Ages. So there's this woman, Patrizia, who's kind of, she's a banker who in her middle life realizes she claims this Roma culture because of her parentage. And she says on page 39, she's kind of talking about, her own ability in Italian is very strong. But she says, my greatest loss, aside from my parents, was that of my people's language. And I think in your work, we often see these characters who, their language is part of their identity in a really deep and profound way. And I was hoping you could maybe touch on that, since it creates a lot of the kind of underlying conflict in these books.
Certainly, the strongest root for identity is language. There's no identity without language. And in my life, I had to deal with this big challenge because I was born into a very Berber family. So my mother doesn't speak Arabic. She speaks just Berber. Berber is the language, is the original language in North Africa. But I was born in Algiers, and so at home I spoke with my parents and my brothers and sisters in Berber, in the street, because I was born in very class neighborhood in Algiers. I learned Arabic Algerian. It's very strange Arabic. There are many French words, and at school I learned Arabic, classical Arabic. I went to a Quranic school. And in the elementary school, third elementary school, I started learning French. So at age 8, 9, I was able to speak in 4 languages. And then when I moved to Italy, I learned Italian. I added Italian, and last year I moved to New York. So this is my stories with languages. So I think my biggest challenge is to mediate between languages. I did this in my life, and then when I moved to Italy, instead of changing language, writing just in Italian, I said to myself, I'm linguistic polygamist. So this is another story. I'm Muslim, so theoretically I can have 4 wives, but I think it's crazy. But I think one wife is, or one husband, it's okay. So 4 languages for me, it will be fantastic. Living between those languages and trying to take the best. Mm-hmm. Because, languages is like the human beings. They have their weakness and their so my idea is that we can, if you are really creative, you can take the best of many languages. And in my Italian actually is very strange Italian. It's not standard Italian because in my Italian style there are a lot of metaphors from Berber, from Arabic, from French. So I'm trying to be really a good mediator between and it would be great to add English in the future, but I have to work. Now I'm a kid. I'm a kid of 2 years. I have 2 years.
Nice. Well, I just want to explore that a little bit more. Since you write in Arabic and Italian, and knowing these languages are very different, can you tell us a little bit about how, as a writer, you are, maximizing the resources of those different languages? What in Italian do you feel like you can do that you can't do in Arabic, or things that you can do in Arabic that you feel like you can't do in Italian, or how has your Arabic changed your Italian?
Well, I have more freedom than a translator, being the author of my books, so I can change, I can add, I can adapt. So probably, the translators don't have this freedom. they are obliged to respect the original. But as I mentioned in the beginning, so my definition of translation is it's to betrayal the original, trying to get the best. So when I start to writing, I'm really obsessed with originality, with creativity, and I don't have problem, I mean, to add or to change. There are a lot of examples. For example, in Italian, there is a very common proverb, Dio dal pane a chi non ha dente. Dio dà pane a chi non ha dente. God gives bread to who doesn't have teeth. It's true. That's my wife. She said, okay. In Arabic, we have a different, very important change. They said God gives meat to whose don't have teeth. So here we have bread and we have meat. So so if you want to translate with Google, of course, meat will be meat. But if you are really a creative in this sense, you know that in Italian we use this proverb. So you have to put instead of meat, you have to put bread.
Interesting.
This is just an example, but there are a lot of examples. Of examples.
We haven't really touched on the real humor in your work. I know you talked about jokes in these different languages. There's also a lot of wordplay, a lot of the characters' names. Some of them are kind of charming characters who are also flawed in these interesting ways. Can you tell me, do you have this, when you're writing this book, is it set in motion because of these kind of funny episodes, or are you, do you see these things that are serious that you want to make fun of a little bit?
I told about the context of language. So the context of Italian language is Italian comedy style, la commedia all'italiana. This is a very important genre in Italian cinema in the 60s and the 70s. It's a very original way to narrate the reality and, in very light way. So I studied, this is very important, so important point. I studied philosophy actually in the end of the 80s in Algeria in order to understand my society rationally. So after studying philosophy, I realized that I couldn't understand Algerian society because it was a irrational society. So it couldn't work. So when I moved to Italy, I found another irrational society. So the result was Italian comedy style. So people think that I am very funny. I'm not really very funny, but in my writing I'm very different because the context of my Italian language is Italian comedy style, and my style in Arabic is Italian. The context, the imaginary is Italian. This is very important about language and the context of language. I mean culture.
Yeah. The Prank of the Good Virgin of Amor. It's a lot of fun, but as I said, it has these really interesting overtones. I also want to talk about the work of Young-Moon. This is the book that I alluded to earlier, even though A Contrived World it just is coming out and apparently is available here at the book festival. Young-Moon is a translator himself, translator writer, similar to Idra. And when I've read your work, I think what's striking about it is this tone that you strike. You kind of are your style is it creates this unusual mood. These characters are unpredictable. I feel like, as it is Sunday, and the title of this collection is A Most Ambiguous Sunday, I would just read from the beginning of it, just to give you a sense of, the kind of mood and spirit of this particular story, but of much of Young-Moon's work. Strange. The vivid feelings I felt just a moment ago have vanished, and now everything is so ambiguous to me. I barely feel the existence of anything. And today, which hasn't even ended yet, already feels like ancient history, like some long-forgotten day from my childhood. All the days seem like Sunday, too, as if only Sunday exists, he mumbles. His alarm clock rings and he opens his eyes. He remains still for a moment, and then, while blinking, he looks at the calendar on the wall. It's Sunday again, a day I've never liked, a day I just can't seem to like, he grumbles. Soon he gets up from his bed. By the way, is Sunday the beginning of the week or the end of the week? It's always been difficult for me to figure that out, he says. In much of your work, I feel like there's this questioning, there's a kind of, the title of this particular story is Ambiguous Sunday, and I feel like there's kind of this hesitation and amorphousness that's in your work. Can you tell us a little bit about how, as a writer, you've created this style?
It's quite contradictory because I'm a writer and translator, but sometimes I hate writing, and most of the time I really hate translation.
Right.
And because translation is really my key way of living, right. And it supports me. Right. And without translation, I think I might have not become a writer. I don't have any desire to write my own stories. After graduation, when I didn't know what to do with my life, then I, by chance, came to translate a book, which was really good, which was the Trophy of Cancer by Harry Miller.
Oh yeah, the Tropic of Cancer.
It was translated long ago in Korea, but the translation was actually is how to say it? Is some pirates edition because
I see. Right.
without any approval of
right.
copyright, and actually this one was translated into Japanese, and someone who studied Japanese translated from Japanese to Korean. So it's absurd, and the translation was really terrible, and he actually edited himself. He skipped the difficult parts, and he filled up the empty spaces himself. Yeah. So someone had to translate again.
Right.
So I did it, and before this translation, I don't know. I vaguely thought of becoming a writer, but I don't know how to write at all. I don't write on regular basis. So I had really hard time to write some small little letter to my girlfriend. So, but I when I finished, it took a long time to finish this particular book because it was really challenge to translate, and but when I finished this book, I unknowingly I came to acquire know how to write because when I write in my own language before I was not trained, I don't know how to put some sentences in the right order, and the sentence is something you can epitomize your thoughts and put it in the best way, and it's it's something how I learned to do that kind of job, and after that I translate some Raymond Carver's
right?
His great short storyteller, and I learned a lot how to convey your feelings or thoughts in a very short sentences, and how to conceal your feeling without tearing outwardly, and yeah, I think the best book I translated was the English writer John Fowles.
Right.
I think the best one is collection of stories. It's called The Ebony Tower.
The Agony Tower.
I translated the titles of Fowles, but they were a little bit disappointing. They were written in his early days of his career, and but The Ebony Tower was really written in his prime time. Yeah, it's the book is composed of about 5 novellas and short stories, and it's so the ambience and sentences and characters, all things in this book are so subtle and so ambiguous, and it's really hard to catch the real meaning and get.
Well, I think those things come through in your work too. That you mentioned that sense of contradiction. I think there is a great deal of subtlety in your stories. That they unfold in these really. I don't know if I have a good word for it. I'm thinking of ways of things unfold, or there's just a lot of very precise moments that take place, or the order in which something happens seems to be very important in your work.
Yes.
One of the things that I'm curious about, since there are so many people here who are from San Francisco and California. You have this new book that's out in English, A Contrived World, where you have San Francisco, but these kind of imagined ideas of San Francisco or places that are kind of come out of the imagination based on San Francisco. Can you tell us more about this book?
Yes, this one was written when I stayed as a writer resident in San Francisco in 2010 for 5 months. And actually, I was writing residence at UC Berkeley, but I've been to the Berkeley before, and there was nothing much to do, so sorry.
You've changed some of that.
I found a house in San Fran, and I think it was a great choice in the end. Yeah, and I don't intend to write because at the time I was, as a writer, very exhausted and like to have a vacation. But I don't plan much. I don't want to do big things. I just strolled around the street and found the small things like that, and so I wrote some memos and put them together, and it became a novel. One thing I funny is that I actually like American writer Richard Brautigan.
Oh, right.
It's many of you.
Richard Brautigan.
Yeah, may know. And I kind of made research on him because he basically lived in the city most of his time. And after residence program, I was able to choose some place to travel. For about 2 weeks, and I don't want to go anywhere. I thought of
Nice.
everywhere in the world,
Right.
from Alaska to Cuba, But and I like to go to Costa Rica, and just because I like to see very colorful, exotic Costa Rican parrot in the jungle. So I was thinking of dyeing my hair very colorfully.
You could do that here in Berkeley.
Imitating this colorful parrots, and maybe we can see each other in the jungle, middle of the jungle, and see very startled, and and actually I ended up go to Hawaiian island, Honolulu, and at the time I was rereading Richard Brautigan's novel, which is Miss Hochrein. Miss Hochrein's master. Is it correct?
Does anyone know?
Something like that. Yeah,
Okay.
Miss Hochrein's master, something like that.
Okay.
It's a little bit not so literary, but it's really original and amazing story. Yeah. It's
Also funny.
really funny because at the beginning, there are two guys who are contracted killers who are supposed to kill someone on Hawaii, an island, on a ranch. And it was a long time ago, and they were sailing on the boat. It took about 3 months from mainland to Hawaii. They were so tired, and they talked really bad things about Hawaii on their way to Hawaii, and they said how much they hate Hawaii. They hate this trip to Hawaii. It's more, so pages are full of these dialogues. And when they got there, and they were to kill a man, but when they saw a man who was teaching his son how to ride a horse, these two killers got some weekends, and so they gave up, and then they comes back for 3 months on the ship, cursing about Hawaii.
I think that's a terrific description of that story. I think that one of the things that Young-Moon does in his work is it really does have this humor and kind of circuitousness. You don't know where you're going. Some of the characters are just strange or funny or not socially correct in many ways. Also, now I'm sitting here thinking I want to reread Trout Fishing in America. Before we wrap up for the day, I want to hear some questions from the audience. Some of you may be curious about translation or about these particular works we've described. I'm going to start with this young woman right in front of me. Yes?
I was wondering if any of you have any favorite, or I guess any theory of translation that you would recommend to someone who's a beginner.
And the question is, do you have a theory or philosophy about translation that you might want to share with someone who's starting out?
Yeah, well, I'm trying to think of one particular. There's a really great collection of essays. It's called the Translation Studies Reader by Lawrence Venuti, and that Venuti. And he's a translation studies scholar, but that one collection just has, it's a compendium of all kinds of writing on translation, from classical times through thinking about how the Odyssey has been translated, basically it's through Romanticism up until now, and you have Nabokov has a very famous essay. I can't remember what, but it's like a lot of really great essays. And I think, the way that I've learned when I was translating, I had a lot of questions about how do you do this? How literal do you make it? How much can you go off, kind of on your own? I think the question of, this is a little bit of a tangent, but I think the question of humility versus ego in writing and translation is really fascinating. And I think when I first started this book, I came into it with a lot of humility, but bordering on insecurity. I thought, like, can I do this? How can I do justice to this amazing writer? How can I be responsible to it and be perfect? And by the end, I realized that I had to really just own my ego about it. And you really do have to also give respect to the original, but also just have a coherent voice and have enough of confidence or ego in what you're doing, to take some chances. Yeah, but I'd say, I've read that book, but just Googling different translators now, there are all kinds of interviews.
There are a lot of terrific resources online. including at the Center for the Art of
Looking for
Translation.
one short thing, I would say that Anne Carson, who is a fantastic writer-translator, has an essay called Variations on the Right to Remain Silent. And I teach that a lot and actually return to it myself. I think she also does a lot of inventing in form, the way that I think you do in your work. I loved, it didn't come up as much, but Amara Lakhous' earlier book called Clash of Civilizations over an elevator in Piazza Vittorio is fantastic. I adored that book. And I'm going to get a copy of this one afterward, but and I can get it signed. But Variations on the Right to Remain Silent is a fantastic essay, and it's not so much craft suggestions as it's sort of like a series of metaphors about what the act of translation and the role of silence in it entails, and about the subtext, and how there is a violence in what you don't say. And I think that is certainly true both of as a translator and as a writer, and I it's one of those things that you read it and it kind of gets embedded in your own process. So I'd recommend that.
Do either of you have a philosophy of translation?
Actually, I have an advice, important advice. So I think you can become translator if you have a really strong passion, because you are not going to make money by translating. No. And it's so frustrating for very simple reason, because translating is really hard work. You have to work and to work and to work. So if you have to make money, you have to translate a lot. And of course the quality will be very, very low. The second what's the second reason? I'm going to probably I answered.
I have one more recommendation. Idra jogged my memory. So one I would also recommend is Lydia Davis writing about translating Madame Bovary. It's the 18th translation of Madame Bovary in the Paris Review. And that is so great because Lydia Davis is also a really great writer. And so she has this really detailed way of just like taking you through her process of, you have these questions. If you're retranslating something, should you look at the previous translations? And she looked at everyone and kind of took what she liked and then went in other directions. So, and it's, she's just hilarious. So I recommend that too.
I found it. So when the book is fantastic, so certainly people are going to say, great writer. When the book is not good, so this is translation. This is the good. So see, this is a big frustration. I mean, and I know because between Italian language, I can read very, very good in Arabic and Italian. There are a lot of, for example, a lot of books in Arabic. I read the book in Arabic and they said very awful books. In Italian translation, it was wonderful. That means the translator works a lot, not just in translation, but in editing and. This is a wonderful work, but very often,
I agree. Jorge Luis Borges said that the translator's job was to improve the original in some way. And he took characters and even changed the gender. And he's like, why is the neighbor a man? He should be a woman living next door.
There are many, many examples of that. I'm going to start here on the right. This woman in blue. Question is, she's written a book and is interested in having it translated into Spanish, and how might you go about doing that? I don't know if anyone wants to take a spin at that. I think it really depends on where you want to have that published. If you want that published in the United States, we have different kind of publication. The way our publishing works is different than it might be in a South American country. And having the Spanish rights, I'm not sure how that works in the Americas. But I would actually, I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards about possibly contacting some Spanish translators if you're interested. I'm going to take a question from this gentleman in black.
Amara talked some about how he feels like translating is kind of a traitorous act inherently, and I just kind of wanted the rest of the panel to talk about whether or not they kind of agree with that, and
sure.
As a follow-up, if they do agree, like how should we feel as readers reading, like, you know, have I never really read Tolstoy because it's never going to be authentic, you know, how do I?
So the question, if I'm getting it right, is, you know, is it true that as a translator you're a traitor, or how do you feel about that construction? And then the second part of the question is, you know, does that mean as readers you can't really know a work unless you read it in its original language, such as Tolstoy in Russian?
I already.
You already said it.
This is the question.
Translator, traitor.
Traitor. Are you a traitor?
Yeah, kind of a traitor, but yeah, I think the basic principle is to be as much faithful as possible to the original text. It's the maybe the very critical base. I don't know so many languages, but in my case, I translate English books into Korean, and in some cases, some books I really like to translate, but can't translate because the differences between the languages, the orders and linguistic problems when it's translated into Korean, it lost so much of its original virtues.
Sure.
So it's better not to translate.
Right.
Yeah.
Do either of you want to jump in?
I mean, I think that is one of the most common sayings you hear about translation, especially when you're a translator. And I think if you think of the original as a sacred text, you know, then you're going to mess up the word of God or the goddess. But I like to think of translation as a performance. So you're performing a script, or you're kind of doing your interpretation of it. And so I do think it's a kind of living interpretation or version of the original. And of course, I mean, I think if you're wedded to this idea that you can carry every single thing from the original into the new one, then you're just going to have a meltdown. So yeah, you have to. I like to think of it as like, this is my Clarice voice that I'm doing, and someone else maybe in the future will do a different one. So, and I think that's why another thing that's often said about translations is that you need them to be kind of renewed every several generations or so, or, you know, there's always room for another version of a book. Yeah.
I mean, I was intimidated by translating Clarice Lispector too, because she's been sort of a literary hero of mine since college. I kind of moved to Brazil in order to learn Portuguese and read her in original because her writing meant so much to me. And I think that you do translate at the frequency of your time, and it is a provisional work in a way, and you're translating at a frequency, and, you know, maybe the radio frequency will be different in 10, 15 years, and I found that kind of a relief. I'm just translating the frequency of my sensibility, you know, in our time, and maybe someone will return at a different frequency in the future. I can't imagine what that will be when people have like their phones implanted in their brains, what that frequency will be. But I don't know, and I hope future translators will return to Lispector's work and make their own art of it. So,
and I'll just add that you know, we often focus on what is lost in translation, but I feel like we gain so much in translation. As Amara was, I think many of the panelists today were saying, you know, by moving it into a new language, there are things that you gain, there are things you can try. Different languages have different assets and resources that, you know, we are so fortunate that the range of work we can read in English includes these masterpieces from other languages. I think we have time for maybe one very brief last question. How about this woman right here? Sure, please.
So I've been translating since 2002, and my entire career I've been told never to translate into anything but your mother tongue. The professional thing is to translate into your mother tongue. I started out as a literary translator, now I'm a professional. I mean, it's really interesting how, I mean, not that that is a literary translation, but I think it's really interesting that we have a panel where two people on this panel writing a language that's not their mother tongue, and then two people on this panel translating to a language that is their mother tongue. So I was wondering if you could speak a little bit to the ramifications of working in a language that's not your mother tongue.
And the question is, in essence, translating from a language that's not your mother tongue into a language that is your mother tongue. Is that correct? Or the opposite? The translating from a language that is perhaps more familiar to a language that is not your mother tongue. Does anyone want to speak to that?
I am critical about the concept of mother tongue. So the conception, the idea of the mother tongue is really Western idea. So you have just one mother. In Algeria, for example, I have three mothers. I have my biological mother and two other mothers, my aunts. I call them mother. So for me, Italian is my mother tongue in Algerian definition or Arabic definition. So I think the main point is about your knowledge, your capacity to move in language. You can be, I mean, Spanish or American, but you don't have you don't have access to this language. A friend of mine is an Italian translator, Francesco. He knows Arabic more than millions of Arabs, and really than 1,000 of writers, because he studied Arabic in incredible way. So he can translate it actually. He can translate from Italian to Arabic and from Arabic to Italian easily. So this is not just mother tongue, but...
Yeah, I agree with that too. I think it is a notion. I think it's, that we think that there's this native language. And even if you're applying, at least in New York State, when you're applying, sending your kids to public schools, you have to list them as only being able to speak one language. So my kids, they're native speakers of Spanish. They spoke more Spanish than English, but they definitely are completely bilingual. And there was no place to represent a bilingual person. When you're sending someone to school, you have to just choose the native language, the mother tongue. So that even in the bureaucracy of applying for public schools in the United States, there's really no space to claim, two moms, linguistically.
And I'll just jump in with a random fact, which is if you look at people who know language really well, like champion spellers, many of them are not native English speakers. These are people who are really interested in language and have the facility to see words and patterns in words that maybe as a native speaker you wouldn't have. That concludes our session. Thank you so much for joining us. One more round of applause. Katrina Dodson, Idra Novey, Amara Lakhous, Jung Young-Moon.